Good evening, visitors, and welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony. My name is Richard Cruz, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Navy is Captain Nick Tate. We acknowledge the family of Private Harold Stewart Slack, whose story will be told shortly, and who are watching this ceremony online. We welcome members of the ACT Reserve Forces Day Council. We would also like to welcome those who have joined us today to commemorate Reserve Forces Day, which recognises the service and achievements of the Reserve Forces of the Australian Defence Force. And we are honoured to acknowledge both former and current serving members of our Reserve Forces, and we thank you for your service. As always, we welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by visitors to the memorial. If you're able, I invite you all to please stand and join in singing the National Anthem. If you're able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn their loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first we present a lament, Flowers in the Forest. Wreaths and floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Private Harold Stewart Slack. Harold Slack was born to Charles and Isabel Slack in 1884 in the New South Wales town of Orange. Known as Harry to his family and friends, he attended schools in Orange and Braidwood. He worked as a rubble mason and blacksmith and married Eugene Maud Stanley. Slack was keen to aid the war effort, enlisting in the Australian Imperial Force in December 1914. He joined the 8th Battalion in Victoria and trained for about 2 months at the Broadmeadows camp north of Melbourne. In February 1915, he sailed on the troop ship Clan MacGillivray to the Australian Army camp at Alexandria in Egypt. Slack did not participate in the Gallipoli landings on the 25th of April, as he'd been admitted to hospital on Lemnos Island the week before with pneumonia. When he recovered, he rejoined his battalion on Gallipoli. The day after he arrived, a major Turkish offensive began that tested the strength of the Australian and New Zealand troops, but was successfully repelled. In June, Slack was wounded by gunfire. He was evacuated to St Andrew's Hospital in Malta, where he recuperated until September, when he then rejoined his unit on Gallipoli. Toward the end of the year, British commandos decided to withdraw from the peninsula, and Slack returned to Egypt in January 1916. In Egypt, Slack transferred to the 1st Australian Pioneer Battalion, presumably drawing on the building skills he'd developed before the war as a rubble mason. He trained in the skills of trench and bridge building and road repair. The men of the 1st Pioneer Battalion arrived in Marseille in April and then trained north to the Western Front. Slack excelled at his work and rose through the ranks over the next year to become a sergeant. In March 1917, Slack went to England to further his training. The hardships of trench warfare and poor health took a toll on many soldiers. On the 30th of July 1917, Slack was reported absent without leave for about 6 weeks. During this time, his cousin Albert Edward Campbell, also of the 8th Battalion, died in hospital in England, about 45 kilometres from Slack's training camp. Soon after returning to service in October 1917, Slack was admitted sick to hospital in the English village of Sutton Veny. He again absconded, this time for 3 months. Military police eventually arrested him in London, and at the subsequent court-martial, he was sentenced to 4 months' detention and reduced to the rank of private. Most of his sentence was remitted, and he returned to his unit in France in July 1918. In August 1918, the 1st Pioneer Battalion was supporting Australian troops around the French village of Villiers-Bretonneux. Early on the morning of the 13th of August 1918, Slack's company were engaged in building strong points in the front lines, where his work party was hit by a German artillery shell. The shell landed where Slack was working, badly wounding him and killing several of his comrades. He was evacuated to a field ambulance where he died about 8:30 that morning. He was 34 years old. 3 of Slack's relatives served in the First World War. His brother-in-law, Private Herbert Stanley Arter, was killed at Pozières in 1916. As well as his cousin, who had died of illness in England in 1917, another cousin, Private Cyril Stewart Campbell, returned to Australia at the end of the war. Harry Slack is buried in Villiers-Bretonneux Communal Cemetery. He's survived by his parents, 6 sisters, and his wife Eugene, and their 3 children. Private Harold Stewart Slack is listed on the Roll of Honour on my right, among more than 60,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. A photograph of his headstone is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private Harold Stewart Slack, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old. They shall grow not old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Poziere or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes this evening's last post ceremony. We thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.